Hi there. Coming to you from my home office here in Clintonville, Wisconsin, and want to talk with you today about Anthea Butler's book, White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America. Hope that these little mini lectures will help sort of pave the way for your own reading and understanding, and that maybe I'll pose some questions that you'll want to follow up in your reading response papers as well. So let's jump right in to the introduction. Racism, page 2, is a feature, not a bug, in white evangelical racism. And I would go so far as to say that Anthea Butler may be restricting the narrative a little bit. I suspect racism is a feature, not a bug, of white mainline Protestant Christianity, including that associated with ULS, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, as well. It's a feature, not a bug. And within evangelicalism, at least, Butler traces that narrative quite clearly. She lays it out for you. She's going to work through the slaveholding religion back to the 17th century and even the 16th century in some locations, through Reconstruction, the Jim Crow era, Billy Graham, and revivalism, birtherism, Islamophobia, and then the reign of so-called King Cyrus, Donald Trump. A lot of what Butler is describing falls under the category of the new religious right. That is the synthesis of the old moralism associated more, I believe, with Arminianism than with Calvinism, which is what Butler associates it with. But I think it's more the Arminianism, that is, this emphasis on moral choice and individual moral choice in particular, as the dynamic at the core of Christianity, or what Christianity is really all about. It seems to me that's characteristic of evangelicalism more than the Calvinism and its emphasis on predestination and manifest destiny, that I think really should be lodged more in many ways with mainline Protestants like Lutherans, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and folks like that. If you just look at the number of presidents who were associated with the various denominations, we've had one or maybe two evangelicals, Jimmy Carter and possibly George Bush, and then Trump reverted to form in the Presbyterian. He's a Presbyterian nominally, at least. Anyway, undergirding both of those, whether it's Arminianism or Calvinism, is this moralism, the politics of morality, as Butler puts it, that then is fused with nationalism and imperialism, empire building. And page 9, I think Butler puts it really succinctly, that in much of public discourse, there is an equation of Christianity with whiteness. And this is whiteness not as some sort of biological fact, but whiteness as a construct that's been malleable and has changed and has produced all kinds of trouble in the history of the United States. Page 10 and 11, Butler lifts up this persecution complex associated with evangelicalism, especially in recent decades, at least. And I wonder just how much that persecution complex is related to the emphasis on the cross, and in particular sacrificial atonement in evangelicalism. That's just a question to sort of pose out there. What kind of atonement is operative within evangelicalism that then fuels this kind of white evangelical racism? And I suspect this persecution complex has a lot to do with the theology of the cross and crucifixion, operative even within evangelicalism, leaning towards, as Luther would put it, probably a theology of glory. Underneath it all, that is glory, this self-interested effort to hold on to power and privilege. Worth noting that within much of evangelicalism down to today, sin is understood as individual moral failing. You know, don't drink, don't smoke, don't swear, etc. These kinds of things. Don't fuck around. And that sort of dynamic narrows very much the focus of historic Christianity, which has been much more about systems and their operation. Unfortunately, many Christians have also been complicit with systems of domination, and I think saying that and admitting that honestly is absolutely crucial. Along with that, on page 11, Butler lifts up the patriarchal culture at the core of white Christian evangelicalism, and absolutely right on. The intersection between racism and patriarchy is absolutely important to maintain and hold on to, because you can't really change one without changing the other structurally, I believe. Any system of domination is likely to reiterate itself, repeat itself, and transmute itself into another dynamic. And if you want to understand the patriarchy that's really deep and sinister within evangelicalism, there's a wonderful book by a dear friend of ours, Betty DeBerg, entitled Ungodly Women, Gender in the First Wave of American Fundamentalism, in which she argues basically, and I think rightly, all of the emphasis on biblical inerrancy was a smokescreen. What was really going on in the everyday lives of people is that men were feeling threatened by the first wave of feminism and used the Bible to reinforce patriarchy and hierarchical structures that kept women down. The same, of course, is true of the way the Bible has been used to justify race. And in chapter 1, Butler takes us into these racist foundations. Through a real quick history of slavery, the lost cause, Jim Crow, and lynching. Two passages in the Bible that Butler lifts up, Genesis 9, 18 to 27, and then Ephesians 6, 5 to 7. Both of these, really distorted badly to justify white supremacy, whiteness over blacks. And if you want to read some really good work that's been done, and another source on this, Jennifer Glancy, has written widely about biblical slavery and the way it is assumed in the text and normative in the text in ways that we really need to read very carefully, and in many cases, read against the literal understanding of Scripture, which took into account assumed Roman practices of slavery. Nice section on Frederick Douglass and the slaveholder religion. If you'd like to read more about this, my book, Empire of Sacrifice, has a chapter on that really builds on Douglass's understanding that the slaveholding religion took from Christianity elements and then attached them to this system of domination that turned people into property. Butler does a really nice job with the religion of the lost cause and how it also was sort of a hybrid construction of Christianity and Southern nationalism, focused through narratives of nostalgia and rituals of domination, notably lynching. These rituals of domination are underneath sort of the memorialization of the Confederacy, and it's for this reason that it's so important that we address that issue, and perhaps some of you would like to take up some of those matters as an issue in public theology. The KKK, of course, emerges in association with this religion of the lost cause, gets suppressed officially, and then burst back onto the scene in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, especially in the Midwest, and of course the South. I experienced this vividly early in my career when I was teaching with undergraduates at Valparaiso in Indiana, and perhaps you'll permit me the digression of a little story about this. I learned through some of the African American students with whom I was sitting in the gospel choir. I learned that the KKK was planning a rally on the courthouse steps. The courthouse of Valparaiso, like many Midwestern towns, is right in the center of town, town square with this beautiful, huge courthouse, late 19th century sort of Victorian monumental architecture. And the KKK was coming. So I thought, well, we can't allow that to stand without some alternative gathering or presence, at least. And so I organized a group of students to come with me on a march, and we announced to the campus that we were going to be marching to the courthouse for a peaceful protest where we would sing and pray um, as an alternative presence, certainly alternative Christian presence, given that the KKK claimed to be Christian, as you probably know. Anyway, so we had this all set up, and I had about 150 students who had agreed to go with me. This was on homecoming weekend, actually, at Valparaiso. And the night before we were slated to go, the rally was going to be on a Saturday morning, I received a call first from the campus police, the chief of campus police at Valparaiso, who said to me, Dr. Paul, we don't think you should march. We can't guarantee your safety. And I listened to what he said to me, and I said, okay, well, we're going to be peaceful. We're going to pray and sing, and I think we'll be okay. But I appreciate your concern. Thank you very much. I hung up the phone. Now, 5 minutes later, got a phone call from the county sheriff. And guess what he said to me? We can't guarantee your safety. And I started thinking, whose side are you on here? Needless to say, we marched, we sang, we prayed. The KKK showed up, got out of their minivans and cars, and got their kids dressed with the white hoods. It was absolutely gross. And they handed out literature on the courthouse steps while we sang and prayed. They were on the north side, we were on the south side. Everything was fine, of course. And some of my students picked up the literature that they were distributing afterwards, and it was sad. It was truly sad. Misspellings, just complete misunderstanding of American history. And thank you for allowing me that digression. And perhaps it can illumine how, when we're doing public theology, we have to take into account all of the different structures of American society, including policing. And perhaps some of you will want to write on that as a part of your work, how the police has taken on this quasi-religious aura for many in the United States. This, Blue Lives Matter signs, and we, stand with the blue and that kind of bullshit. That's, widely present, unfortunately, among us. Nothing against the police, but, I want signs in people's yards, emphasizing peace growing, not militarization and policing. Page 30, Butler, lynching was itself a religion. Definitely, human sacrifice in barbaric modes, connecting as such barbarism to Christianity as well. And if you want to read more about this, somebody could do some work on Ida B. Wells, extraordinary woman out of Chicago who really led the anti-lynching campaigns in the early 20th century, and a profound public theologian in her own right. Not enough work has been done on her. Chapter 2 takes us into the 1960s, and Butler does a really nice job, I think, of deconstructing Billy Graham as sort of this evangelical, genteel figure who's a kinder, gentler racist. Increasingly critical of Dr. King, even though he had tried some rapprochement, but used the language of extremism to associate King with violence, which of course is not the case. Reverend Dr. King was an advocate of Gandhian nonviolence, and so this emphasis on extremism and gradualism by Graham reveals the racist core of his outreach, in fact. No black denominations were part of the National Association of Evangelicals when it was founded in 1943. And I really like what Butler did on 40 to 41, where she connected anti-communism as an ideology with racism, with white supremacist ideologies. And here, I think to complement what Butler is doing, it might be important to highlight the role of apocalypticism in evangelical thought. for many historians of fundamentalism and evangelicalism, it is in fact this sort of millennial future focus that's been a crucial feature, that even some went so far as to say even the crucial feature. And if you understand sort of the role of apocalypticism within evangelicalism, you can see how it is profoundly driven by fear and by a version of the story that legitimates all kinds of violence leading up to this end, the rapture, that then rescues, a few and leaves the rest of humanity behind. If you want to understand the lack of empathy for the planet and for suffering people, I think this apocalyptic thread is an important one in public theology to pick up and explore for its racism. A book like The Late Great Planet Earth in the 1970s, and then sort of a redux version, 13, 14 volumes, I don't know what they were, of Left Behind, and some really terrible movies as well. Folks like Billy James Hargis, Jerry Falwell, and company really gave rise to this linkage between anti-communism and white supremacy. Hargis, in particular, page 47 and 49, really linked King to communism, sort of as a shill for J. Edgar Hoover in his attempts to undermine the civil rights movement as well. Chapter 3, The Rise of the New Religious Right, then takes us into the history of that ongoing development that surprised many people but shouldn't have. I actually did my master's thesis in 1983 entitled Old and New in the New Right, really focusing on the continuities within the new religious right. And if you look at page 58 in Butler in particular, I think it's really great that she highlights, and I'm just going to quote her here, this is the top of the page. While abortion is commonly understood as the issue that began to unite evangelicals in the 1970s, I give that dubious honor to the issue of race. Race hatred played the fundamental role in first pushing evangelicals toward a colorblind gospel, which would provide cover for their racially motivated organizing against the federal government. And second, their push to block implementation of the hard-won gains of the civil rights movement. This colorblind gospel is how evangelicals use biblical scripture to affirm that everyone, no matter what race, is equal and that race does not matter. The reality of the term colorblind, however, was more about making Black and other ethnic evangelicals conform to whiteness and accept white leadership as the norm, both religiously and socially. That's absolutely spot on, I think, and it's really important for us to recognize how calling oneself colorblind is a way of resorting to the norm of white supremacy. Some nice work by Butler on Tom Skinner and Bill Pannell, and the critique of white evangelical racism, which is ongoing. The critique especially of individuals like Bob Jones, Paul Weyrich. Interesting here in this chapter, the association between Roman Catholics and evangelicals, between some Roman Catholics, and increasingly among the bishops of the Roman Catholic Church and evangelicals, is an important thread to pick up, and perhaps somebody wants to explore that theme in their final projects. Page 75, what the new religious right was about was mobilizing white Christians and then demonizing liberals, including demonizing African Americans and other progressives. It's important to highlight, too, how on page 80, many evangelicals welcomed performances of Christian Blackness. As Butler puts it, I think it's crucial to recognize this painful dynamic that there are individuals from discrete racial groups who will cooperate with racists. And, it's a truly complicated question. At what point does that cooperation become complicity? At what point are you selling out, and that's a question I cannot answer, but that really needs answering. Where is the line, and how do you draw it when it comes to working with people who are avowedly or unaware even of their participation in racist systems? So accommodationism and that dynamic is part of the challenge that I think Butler lifts up for us really nicely here, including telling her own story as an evangelical and how she finally left evangelicalism after her studies at Fuller Seminary and her participation in the church on the way. Real quickly, chapter 4 and the conclusion then, 21st century precipice, as she puts it. I think that's right. Really nice tracking of how Islamophobia is a form of racism that perpetuates the white supremacy of someone like Trump, and how Trump could play on, racist tropes on many levels. Islamophobia, anti-Asian racism, anti-Black racism, and of course anti-Latinx racism in his immigration emphasis. Once again, the role of apocalypticism is important to lift up, and this sense of, the binaries, the us versus them dynamic, the saved versus the reprobate and the damned, and, very clear delineations of who's in one group and who's in the other. Those binaries are important to lift up, along with eschatology, soteriology, or the theologies of salvation, are really troubling within evangelicalism in ways that can perpetuate systemic racism and systemic sin. So near the end of the chapter, she doesn't put it in these terms, but she talks about the cultural contradictions of evangelicalism. On the one hand, claiming to be Christian and yet showing no empathy for the suffering. Katrina is a great example of this. The coronavirus, COVID-19, is another example of this kind of willful blindness, claiming a very narrow understanding of what Christianity is all about, and then refusing to extend empathy even to those who are clearly suffering and in some cases dying. Dominant in public life. I mean, it drives me crazy how much attention evangelicals get in the news and in public discourse, how much their talking points make their way into the mainstream news, and yet claiming at the same time to be victims. This sort of persecution complex, this contradiction of public dominance in discourse, and yet claiming to be a persecuted minority, including amazingly to claim to be victims of racism. And I could tell you a story here about a dear friend of my wife that is right in this notion that she's the victim of racism as a white woman. I call it the Karen phenomenon. Maybe somebody wants to pick that up. As somebody might want to take on evangelical understanding of critical race theory. Obviously, that's what Butler is doing here throughout, and it's what we're going to be studying throughout the course of the semester. Sort of Christian critical race theory. Can Christianity embrace critical race theory? My understanding, it must. I've been teaching this kind of thing for 20 years, and yet the demonization of this, again, system thinking rather than individual moralism is really the crucial dynamic. And Sarah Palin is probably a pretty good example of that contradiction. Christology is important to lift up, and Butler doesn't do a whole lot of this, but white evangelicals by and large are beholden to a white, very white Jesus. And here, a supplemental text would be a book by an old buddy of mine, basketball buddy of mine, by the name of Paul Harvey, entitled "The Color of Christ." I think it's being used in some other classes here at the seminary. I considered using it here. Would certainly be worth following up if somebody wanted to do a presentation on our final project on images of Christ. I don't think there's anything more important in many congregations to undo then this prominence of these white Jesus figures. I mean, it's historically inaccurate and it's blatantly racist in many cases as well, and yet widespread in Lutheran churches, among many others, not just evangelicals, to blame for this distortion and domination. 123 to 133, Butler gets us into the evangelicals, as she puts it, the Tea Party opposition to Barack Obama's presidency, overt racist slurs here, and the dynamic of the religious freedom argument to justify, white evangelical racism and sexism, homophobia, etc. Tisa Wenger has really done some great work as a historian, friend of mine from my days at Princeton. Check out her work on religious freedom if you're interested in that thread in public theology. And then Dylan Roof, the shooter in Charleston. I'm going to be part of a symposium, a 2-day intense workshop on religion and racial violence in houses of worship. And I'm going to be studying in particular Dylan Roof's public theology and connecting it in two trajectories. One is to the closing of the only Lutheran historically black college or university, Selma, and College of Selma, and then the religiosity of Donald Trump, because I think while Trump is nominally Presbyterian, in fact, his operative religious theology was sort of a hybrid of white evangelical racism and civil religious racism and nationalism. This kind of hybrid theology is important to begin untangling. I mean, hybrids are the strongest moving forward, but hybrids are also the most damaging and dangerous as we look at the history of religion in the United States. Butler's conclusion on 138, evangelical is an Americanized Christianity born in the context of white Christian slaveholders. I think that's a fact, and a fact with profound significance for understanding where we are right now. Good, she says, is predicated on whiteness in the United States, the way those norms operate, to suppress the creativity and contributions of people of color to our history, to the church, not to mention indigenous folks, and we'll be turning there starting next week. And then getting saved for many evangelicals means receiving the white version of Christianity, not persecuted. Butler says she's not interested in persecuting white evangelicals, but in calling us to account. After all, we are a seminary of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Three of those terms are really problematic, aren't they? Evangelical, profoundly misunderstood. Lutheran, if you look at Luther's history, not really great on race. And America, the very term is a misunderstanding and obscures, in many ways, the land theft that continues to endure and be a real problem that we need to address moving forward. So that's it for Butler, week 1, mini lecture in under a half an hour, giving you some cues, some questions, some things to explore in addition to what I think is a really profound text. Anthea Butler is in Philadelphia, and I'm going to see if I can get her to say a few words with us, set up a Zoom perhaps. I know she's busy and don't want to presume on her time, but would love to have her talk with us if there were an opportunity for that to happen. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this. And again, I really look forward to working with you. I hope to put together one of these each week, just to sort of give some cues to the reading, some things that I can pick out. And for next week, then, we will turn to Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz and Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. One of the things I really love about this book is the alternative periodization that she puts together. That is how she understands the history of the United States, American history, if you will, in a really different fashion, and one that focuses less on the sort of heroic triumphs and more on the devastation and violence. And we'll see this played out as well in the novel that we'll be reading as the other part of Unit 1 on Indigenous History and Public Theology, namely the book by Louise Erdrich, one of my favorite writers, entitled Tracks, that really focuses on the early 20th century, 1914 to 1918. You would not know World War I was happening because that had nothing to do with what was happening among the Ojibwe people. And and I just love this novel. So, and I love Ortiz's book. I think it just explodes the kind of triumphalist narratives of American exceptionalism that unfortunately have been far too common in the United States and far too common in American religious history. So we're underway. Look forward to your reading response papers on Butler, and then as we dig into the indigenous history of some peoples who have long association with Christianity and an awful lot to say about what Christians have done in the past. I am going to be in Alaska next week. My wife and I are taking the opportunity to go visit my son and our oldest son, Justin, and daughter-in-law, Genevieve. They've been living there for 4 years. We have not been to see them yet, and we're going to take the chance to go spend some time with them in Juneau. I will be in regular communication, however, and we are fortunate to have with us TA Marta Rose, who can also answer any questions you might have as we move forward. Look forward to working with you, and once again, thanks. Went over half an hour. Sorry. Peace.